In the 1980s, in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, where I make my home, there was a tremendous trial going on for one of the world's leading pornographers. His name was Larry Flynt. They said his stuff was so perverse that it actually made Playboy magazine stuff look tame. But Larry Flynt had a brilliant lawyer who had one goal in mind. He had a goal of erasing distinctions in the way he questioned the witnesses. So first of all, it took them over 5 days to find the first member of the jury, because in order to be a member of the jury, Flynt's lawyer did not want you to belong to a church. If you belonged to a church, you could not qualify to be a fair juror in terms of making any judgment on pornography. They finally got that jury together. And when the witnesses were being questioned by Mr. Flynt's lawyer, he would ask them something like this: have you ever been into an art gallery? Yes, sir. Have you ever been into an art gallery where you've had to pay to get into that? Yes, sir. Have you ever been into an art gallery where you've paid to get into it, where you've seen the paintings of undisrobed people by the great masters of art? Yes, sir. Would you please now explain to the jury why you believe that to be art and my client's stuff to be pornographic? And of course, on a witness stand, what are you going to say? You're going to get into a philosophy of art discussion? No, but if you're sitting at a table one-on-one with a lawyer, I thought to myself, if he gave me a chance to talk about this, I would probably have a tough time and would try to. I'm not a philosopher of art by any stretch of imagination, but I did study moralist philosophers and their reasoning and moral theory and so on. And so I would have said something to him like this: do you remember the story of Michelangelo when he began his paintings? And he started to paint disrobed people. His teacher one day looked at him and said, "Michael, why are you doing this?" He said, "Because I want to see man as God sees man." He said, "But you're not God." And a fascinating discussion followed. Point one, worthy of discussion. But point number two, C.S. Lewis's challenge here is so immense. It is something like this. In his philosophical journey to Christ, in an allegorical form, he tells it in the book A Pilgrim's Regress. The reason he calls it regress rather than progress, and this year, by the way, is the 50th anniversary death of C.S. Lewis. He died the same day that John Kennedy was shot. I think Aldous Huxley, Lewis, and John Kennedy died on the same day, 22nd November 1963. So 50 years have gone by since the death of that great apologist. But in his book, A Pilgrim's Regress, he talks about allegorically how this young man called John was searching for the truth, flirted for a long time with pantheism, and he turned his back upon it, didn't know precisely why. Came to humanism and atheism and the spirit of the age. Something made him terribly uncomfortable. It was only after he found his life in Christ, he said, he took a regressive journey because he had the answers for why it was he had turned away from the other options that were given to him. But at this point in his book, A Pilgrim's Regress, he's in a mountain called the Spirit of the Age, and he's sitting in front of the Neronic stare of he who heads up that mountain, staring down at its occupants, and Lewis pictures himself handcuffed, which is quite fascinating that a man in total liberty is actually allegorically portraying himself as handcuffed, enslaved. And the waiter comes representing the Spirit of the Age and serves him his breakfast, and he takes a drink of the milk and comments on how nourishing, nutritious it is. And when he finishes commenting on that, the waiter says, "You just call it nutritious, nourishing milk. All it is the secretion of a cow, isn't it? Like urine, milk. One is a secretion, is another secretion." John says, "I didn't know how to respond to this kind of nonsense that was coming, but I just let go." And he said, "Then I made the mistake of commenting on the nutritiousness of the eggs." He said, "Then you should have heard the analogy, and I won't repeat it for you." But as those analogies were drawn, and Lewis is sort of now squirming, having taken those eggs into his system and the milk into his system, and the waiter goes away, and then he says this: "Reason came riding on a horse and rescued me and said, 'You lie because you don't know the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for garbage. You don't know the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for refuse.'" You see, the man or the woman in front of the lens of a camera, whose body is being used purely to try to titillate the imagination or the fanciful thoughts of a man or woman in front of you there, in order to provoke just the baser instincts and ultimately leave you unsatisfied and insatiable, because what they are pandering to you is not a person. What they are enslaving you to is a feeling that no one person can ultimately satisfy. They are creating you in a hunger. The imagination is assaulted to the degree that no one human being has the capacity to fulfill this kind of a longing. And somebody in front of that camera ought to say, "Sir, don't do this to me." But ladies and gentlemen, here I think is the tragedy when secularism with a capital S has evicted everything that is sacred and made a free-for-all grab for sensation and feeling alone. It will ultimately eradicate a sense of shame within a culture. Shame is a desperately needed sensation when things are wrong deep within you. Do you know psychiatrists are dealing with the possibility of a medication for post-traumatic stress disorder for those who come back from the battlefield, to give them this morning after pill to help them to erase all the memory of all the trauma they went through? One of their greatest challenges: what if a rapist decides to take it the morning after a rape? What happens to the medication then to dispense it to somebody who can consider to commit criminal acts and yet at the same time want to eradicate the entire memory? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you, you show me a man or a woman or a culture without shame, and I will show you monstrosity in its making. I met a young man in Malaysia who had just escaped from Saddam Hussein's army. He had lunch with my wife and myself. He told me he was taught to do two things in Saddam's army. Number one, to build false passports, and number two, to kill without feelings. He said, "I've become an animal. I have become an animal. How to kill without feelings." Secularization can ultimately eradicate shame.